So ours was the first series of articles in '61, shortly after the data on these bombs were released publicly, the first series of articles that looked at what the medical consequences, if these new bombs were dropped on cities, would be. And of course, our conclusion was that the results on humans would be so horrendous that there was very little that the medical profession could do after the bomb was dropped. And therefore we said, and the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, where this was published, he agreed that the prevention of nuclear war was a medical responsibility. If they are set to explode upon impact with the ground, they raise tons of debris with radionuclides formed within that debris. That debris travels with the prevailing winds. These are the typical winds for a January day in the Boston area, and people as far south as Martha's Vineyard would be killed by radiation from such an explosion. Oh, certainly, and we need to go on from the nuclear weapons, the chemical and biological weapons issues, on to other kinds of environmental questions, but we mustn't forget the dangers that lie there. The world still has 50,000 nuclear weapons. There are still 15 billion tons equivalent power in those warheads. There's 5 billion people in the world, so that's 3 tons, not 3 pounds. 3 tons of TNT for every human being on the planet that exist in nuclear weapons. These issues relate to the work of Physicians for Social Responsibility, a group that started in 1961 around the prevention of nuclear war. And we've become increasingly concerned that chemical and biological weapons can lead toward nuclear war and are themselves weapons of mass destruction. Smallpox, anthrax, hemorrhagic fevers are terrible things. There's no question about it. But one has to ask the question, as we live our lives, what are the chances of that happening to us compared to all of the other things that we can very well protect ourselves against? The main thing to do is to go about one's business, to understand that we live in a dangerous world, and to talk about the ways of making a less dangerous world. What we have to do is give up the crazy system we now have for financing medical care in the United States, and we have to build a system such as every other industrialized country has, and by which to finance our medical care. There's a way out. We just have to make sure that politically we find the way out. I need to say that statistics are people with the tears washed off. That behind these numbers, the numbers are important because it's hard to get political action, it's hard to get change unless one has the numbers. But behind every one of those numbers, there is a human being. And as you just heard, many of those human beings are children.
When more than 125,000 troops received the anthrax vaccine.
There is no decent record keeping. There is no way of knowing what the impact of those 120,000 plus immunizations was. This is a military record that, in my view, is absolutely criminal. And as some of you know, what I've taken to doing is carrying a metronome around and setting the metronome for a periodicity of 1 beat per second. And with each of those beats, a child either dies or is permanently maimed, either physically or mentally, as a result of a completely preventable illness. Now, at the same time, with each of those beats, the world spends $30,000 on arms. The metronome does not just have to toll for other people, it tolls for us as well. With every 6 beats of the metronome, an American falls into poverty. With every 20 beats of the metronome, a child is born into poverty in the United States. With every 30 beats of the metronome, a black child is born. And if he's a boy, he is destined to a life expectancy 7 years less than if a white boy had been born. If she's a girl, she is destined to a life expectancy 5 years less than if a white girl had been born. We have lived in a terrible century in terms of the impact of war on civilians. If we look at the percentage of all deaths that occurred during World War I, some 14% of all deaths in that war were civilian deaths. By World War II, 2/3 of all deaths were civilians. And by the 1980s and the 1990s, some 90% of deaths were civilian deaths. If we go back to World War II and look at how the development of attacks on civilian populations developed. This is a German dive bomber of the type that was used to bomb the city in northern Spain called Guernica. And as you're all aware, that attack on civilians, it was not a military target. It was clearly a terrorist bombing of a civilian target. And Pablo Picasso, in his painting called Guernica, memorialized, immortalized the deaths, the pain, the suffering, the terror of the people who died in Guernica. The areas in red on this slide are the areas in which the women giving birth in 1985 had either no prenatal care at all or prenatal care beginning in the last trimester of the pregnancy. Now, we're not talking about prenatal care beginning in the second trimester, starting in the 4th to the 6th month. This is prenatal care beginning after the 7th month or no prenatal care at all. And over 30% of women in these two areas, the South Bronx and Central Harlem, had that kind of obscene prenatal care. But the key issue for us as a family and for all of us working together has been that it cannot be done individually. That if there is to be any kind of change, if work for change, that it's got to be done in teamwork. It's got to be done with bringing people together. To be successful, work for the health of a community must be a community-based effort. To be successful, work for social justice must be a society-wide effort. To be successful, work for peace must be an effort that brings people together who share a passionate desire for peace. We have to recognize the plague that not only may come, but the deaths and the destruction that is causing right now. The usual ways of working for health workers will not work. We're not talking about an elitist profession that talks only to itself. We're talking about people talking to a great variety of others and trying to bring them along. We do that because we are members of professions that care about people. We do that because we agree with Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell said that a society that cradles its missiles as though they were children and treats its children to obscene living conditions and inadequate health services is neither just nor secure. And if we would be just and secure, if we would be healers, we must move into these areas for the sake of our people and our patients as well. Thank you very much. How does one express what that being together for all these years has meant? We both started out in a very different time. It was a time when the woman was primarily responsible for making sure that the home worked right, and the man went out and did the public things. And over the course of the years, we have all learned, and we have learned from each other, that it doesn't work that way, that it's got to be, in Rondell and his felicitous phrase, a team. And so we molded ourselves together into that team, and Ruth has expressed it far better than I can, but it's been such an incredible privilege to do all of that together with Ruth. Each time a man and a woman stands up for an ideal or strikes out against injustice or acts to improve the lot of others, he or she sends a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And I expect that's what we're all trying to do, and we honor people insane who try to do that, and people at PSR who try to do that, and the doctors who try to do that. And thank you all for the privilege of being with you. We're now in a situation in which the best analogy is two people standing in a room with gasoline up to their knees. And one of them has 7 matches, and the other one has 9 matches. And the one with 7 matches says, if only I had 2 more matches, I would be in a better position to defend myself. The reason I'm not getting into these political arguments is that I think, not better red than dead, I think the ashes of communism will be indistinguishable from the ashes of capitalism. And the ashes of freedom will be indistinguishable from the ashes of anything else. And therefore, what I think is that, yes, we have to defend the principles that we think are important. We must do that. But to build more nuclear weapons, to add to the 16 billion tons of TNT in the world, does not defend freedom, does not defend capitalism, does not defend economic principles, does not defend life, simply produce more death.